When the Tone River breached its banks in the autumn of 1742, transforming the rice fields of the Kanto Plain into an inland sea, the crisis facing the Tokugawa shogunate wasn't simply one of water displacement. It was a crisis of calories. In a civilization where the entire economy was denominated in koku, units of rice sufficient to feed one person for 1 year, a flood didn't just destroy homes and drown livestock. It erased the mathematical foundation of survival itself. The floodwaters that swept through the provinces surrounding Edo carried away more than topsoil and wooden structures. They carried away the carefully calculated surplus that stood between the population and starvation, the reserve that allowed samurai to receive their stipends, merchants to conduct trade, Jew and peasants to survive the lean months before the next harvest. The Japanese archipelago has always existed in an uneasy relationship with water. The same monsoon rains that filled the terraced paddies and allowed rice cultivation to sustain one of the world's densest populations could, with a shift in atmospheric pressure or an unusually warm season in the mountains, become an agent of devastation. The great rivers that drained the central highlands, the Tone, the Shinano, the Yodo, were engineered waterways, their courses deliberately altered by Tokugawa-era civil projects to protect Edo and facilitate commerce. But this engineering came with a price. When these rivers overflowed, they did so with catastrophic force, their redirected currents amplified by the very channels meant to contain them. The flood of 1742 was not an anomaly, but rather an extreme expression of a recurring pattern, a pattern that had shaped Japanese food culture, agricultural practice, and disaster preparedness for centuries. In the immediate aftermath of such flooding, the population faced what we might call the logistics of hunger. This was not simply a matter of opening emergency granaries and distributing rice. The flood had destroyed the infrastructure of distribution itself. Roads were submerged or washed away entirely. The wooden bridges that connected villages had been reduced to splinters, their timber swept downstream to pile against the stone pylons of castle towns. The canals that normally carried flat-bottomed boats laden with rice bales from countryside to city were clogged with debris, transformed into chaotic rivers carrying uprooted trees, the fragments of houses, and the bloated carcasses of drowned animals. The storehouses themselves, the cura with their thick earthen walls and elevated floors, had in many cases been breached. Water had a way of finding every weakness in construction, seeping through foundations, undermining support posts, and turning carefully preserved grain into a fermenting, inedible mass. The Bakufu, the shogunal government, maintained a system of strategic rice reserves distributed throughout the domains. These were not acts of humanitarian foresight in the modern sense, but rather calculated investments in political stability. A starving population was an ungovernable population, prone to peasant uprisings that could destabilize the entire hierarchy. The reserves were held in multiple tiers. The central government maintained stores in Edo itself, a massive warehouse complexes in districts like Asakusa, their contents measured in hundreds of thousands of koku. Domain lords were required to maintain their own reserves proportional to their assessed productivity. Wealthy merchant houses, particularly those involved in rice brokerage, held speculative stores. And individual households, from samurai families to prosperous farmers, kept what they could in elevated storage spaces within their homes. When flood struck, the distribution system activated through a rigid bureaucratic process. The town magistrates, the Machi Bugyo, would assess the damage and calculate the shortfall. This assessment was conducted with remarkable precision, involving detailed surveys of submerged fields, interviews with village headmen, and examination of surviving tax records. The goal was to determine not just how much rice had been lost, but how much would not be harvested in the coming season, and therefore how large the caloric deficit would be over the next 12 months. Based on these calculations, the magistrates would petition the regional daimyo, who would in turn appeal to the shogunal council for authorization to open the emergency stores. But bureaucracy moved slowly, and hunger moved quickly. In the days immediately following the flood, before official relief could be organized, survival depended on what people could salvage, scavenge, or substitute. This is where the true ingenuity of Tokugawa-era food culture became apparent. The Japanese diet of this period was not the refined cuisine we might associate with modern kaiseki traditions. It was a carefully calibrated system of caloric extraction from a limited set of ingredients, a system that had evolved over centuries to wring sustenance from every available resource. Rice was the ideal, the standard, the measure of prosperity. But rice was also a luxury that most people consumed in limited quantities, even in good times. Their bowls extended with other grains, roots, and foraged materials. When the floodwaters receded, leaving behind fields of mud and shattered stalks, the population turned to what we might call the shadow food system. This was the network of supplementary calories that existed parallel to the official rice economy, a network that became visible only in times of crisis. The mountainous terrain that covered much of Japan's land area, unsuitable for rice cultivation, was a vast pantry of edible plants for those who knew where to look. Bracken ferns, their young shoots called warabi, could be harvested in early spring from hillsides. They required careful processing to remove natural toxins, involving repeated boiling and soaking, but they provided bulk and fiber. The inner bark of certain pine trees could be stripped, dried, and ground into a powder that could be mixed with any available grain to extend its volume. This wasn't pleasant eating. The taste was bitter and resinous, but it provided calories. The rivers themselves, even in their flooded state, were sources of protein. As the waters began to recede, they left behind pools and eddies filled with disoriented fish. Carp, catfish, and eels could be caught in baskets and weirs set up in the draining channels. The mud of the paddies, and once it began to dry, could be worked to extract freshwater clams and snails. These were not delicacies, but emergency proteins, often consumed whole, shell and all, crushed and boiled into a kind of mineral-rich gruel. The Japanese had long practiced what we might call total utilization, a philosophy that nothing edible should be wasted. Even the weeds that grew in rice paddies, normally pulled and composted, could be gathered and consumed. Certain varieties of wild grass produced seeds that, while tiny and labor-intensive to harvest, could be ground into a coarse flour. The Buddhist temples, which dotted the landscape and played a crucial role in Tokugawa society, became centers of relief distribution and food innovation during floods. The monks, bound by religious prohibition against taking animal life, had developed an entire cuisine based on plant materials and fermentation. Their expertise became invaluable when conventional food supplies disappeared. Temple kitchens knew how to make protein-rich pastes from fermented soybeans, not just the familiar miso, but varieties using local beans and accelerated fermentation processes. They knew which mountain vegetables could be preserved by pickling in rice bran, extending their edibility for months. They maintained stores of dried daikon radish, whole radishes buried in rice hulls or hung in the rafters of storage buildings, slowly dehydrating into rock-hard cylinders that could be shaved and reconstituted. The social hierarchy of Tokugawa Japan became starkly visible in the patterns of flood survival. Samurai families, even lower-ranking ones, had advantages that peasants did not. Their stipends were guaranteed by their lords, and while a flood might delay payment, it would not eliminate it. They had connections to the merchant class, the ability to secure credit or exchange future rice allocations for present food. Their homes were typically in castle towns, on elevated ground less vulnerable to flooding. But even samurai faced deprivation. A minor foot soldier, a rank-and-file warrior living on a stipend of perhaps 50 koku per year, supporting a household of 6 or 7 people, had little margin for disaster. When the rice brokers' stores were depleted and prices spiked, even these families found themselves eating what they would normally consider peasant food. The merchant class, particularly the rice brokers and moneylenders, occupied an interesting position during flood crises. Though officially ranked below even peasants in the Confucian social order, they nonetheless controlled the actual mechanisms of food distribution. A flood represented both risk and opportunity. Their stored rice might be destroyed, but if they had reserves in unaffected regions, the price spike could generate enormous profits. The shogunate was aware of this dynamic and attempted to regulate it through price controls and forced sales, compelling merchants to sell rice at fixed rates during emergencies. But enforcement was imperfect, and black markets flourished. In the narrow alleys behind the official market districts, rice changed hands at multiples of the controlled price, and merchants who had the foresight to stockpile in secure locations became wealthy even as their neighbors starved. The peasants, who constituted the vast majority of the population, bore the heaviest burden of flood survival. Their relationship with rice was complex and often bitter. They grew it, they tended it through backbreaking labor in the paddies, but they consumed surprisingly little of what they produced. Most of the harvest went to taxes, paid to the domain lord and to the landlord if they were tenant farmers. What remained was supplemented with cheaper grains: barley, millet, buckwheat. A flood that destroyed the rice crop destroyed their tax base and often brought harsh punishment from authorities who still demanded payment. But it also forced them to rely on the survival skills that had been passed down through generations, skills that samurai and urban merchants lacked. Peasant households knew how to process acorns, a food source available in enormous quantities in Japan's extensive oak forests. Fresh acorns are inedible due to their tannin content, which causes severe digestive distress. But through a process of shelling, grinding, and repeated leaching in running water, the tannins could be removed, leaving a nutritious starch that could be made into flour or a kind of tofu. This process took days of labor, work typically done by women and children, while men attempted to salvage and repair flooded fields. The resulting acorn products had a gray color and a slightly bitter taste that no amount of processing could completely eliminate, but they provided calories when nothing else was available. Another emergency food was konnyaku, a gelatinous block made from the tuber of the devil's tongue plant. The tubers could be dug from mountainsides even in poor conditions, and the processing method, which involved grinding the tuber, mixing it with lye water, and allowing it to coagulate, could be done with minimal equipment. Konnyaku had almost no caloric value. It was primarily water and indigestible fiber, but it filled the stomach and created a sensation of satiety. During famines and floods, it became a staple, stretched with whatever grain flour could be obtained to create a more substantial food. The preservation of food took on desperate importance in the aftermath of flooding. Without refrigeration, in a climate that could be hot and humid, spoilage was a constant threat. Salt, that most precious commodity, became more valuable than silver. Coastal villages had a significant advantage here, as they could produce salt from seawater. But inland regions dependent on salt transported from the coast saw prices skyrocket. Fish caught in the receding floodwaters had to be preserved immediately. They were gutted and layered with salt if it was available, or smoke-dried over fires if it was not. The smoking process was done in temporary structures, frameworks of green bamboo that wouldn't burn easily, with the fish suspended over smoldering fires, fed with damp wood to produce maximum smoke. The resulting product was desiccated and hard, requiring prolonged boiling to become edible, but it could last for months. Fermentation, that ancient technology that had given Japan soy sauce, miso, and sake, became a survival tool during floods. Even damaged rice, grain that had gotten wet but not completely spoiled, could be salvaged through fermentation. It would be spread out to dry as much as possible, then inoculated with koji mold, the same Aspergillus oryzo used in sake production. The mold would begin to break down the rice, and if the process was carefully managed, the result could be either a kind of fermented rice paste, or, if allowed to progress with water and more time, a crude alcoholic beverage. This wasn't about recreation or ceremony. Alcohol has caloric value, and fermented foods are preserved foods. A family with the knowledge and the mold spores could transform rice that would otherwise rot into a food source that would last through the winter. The official relief efforts, when they finally materialized, operated through a system called osukui, literally, honorable help. The shogunate or domain government would establish distribution points, often at temples or in market squares, where registered households could receive allocations of rice or rice substitute. The amount was calculated on a per-person basis, typically around 3 go per day, roughly 450 grams of rice, enough for basic subsistence. But the reality of distribution was chaotic and often corrupt. Officials responsible for measuring out the grain had numerous opportunities for skimming. The measuring boxes themselves, the masu, could be modified to dispense slightly less than the official amount. Quality varied wildly. The relief rice was often the poorest grade, mixed with chaff and small stones, requiring careful picking before it could be cooked. Lines at distribution points could stretch for hours, and the elderly and infirm often found themselves unable to compete with younger and more aggressive recipients. There were reports, preserved in local histories and temple records, of fights breaking out at relief stations, of people being trampled in the rush when the distribution began. The samurai assigned to maintain order at these sites faced an impossible task. They were there to prevent riots and ensure orderly distribution, but they were also representatives of the same government that had failed to prevent the disaster or its worst effects. Their presence could inflame rather than calm tensions. Beyond the official relief system, there existed networks of mutual aid that operated along lines of kinship, village affiliation, and religious community. These networks were informal but powerful, rooted in the understanding that disaster could strike anyone, and that survival often depended on reciprocal support. A village whose fields were on higher ground and had escaped the worst flooding might share seed rice with a neighboring village that had lost everything, understanding that the favor would be remembered and returned. Extended family networks stretched across domains, and relatives in unaffected regions would send what they could: bundles of dried fish or bags of millet, carried by traveling merchants or by the recipients themselves who made the journey on foot. The Buddhist concept of fuse, charitable giving, motivated some relief efforts, particularly from temples and wealthy merchant families seeking to accumulate religious merit. But the motivations were never purely altruistic. Merchants who provided emergency rice to a devastated community at reasonable rates, or even as gifts, were investing in future goodwill and commercial relationships. Temple relief efforts served to reinforce the temple's position in the community and attract donations once prosperity returned. The samurai class, meanwhile, understood that providing effective relief was essential to maintaining the social order that kept them in power. As weeks turned to months after a major flood and the immediate crisis of starvation was navigated, the population faced what might be called the long hunger. The next rice harvest was months away, and even when it came, the yield would be reduced. Flooded fields required extensive work to restore them to productivity. The standing water had to drain completely, which could take weeks depending on soil composition and drainage infrastructure. Once drained, the fields were often covered with a layer of silt, sand, or gravel deposited by the flood. This material had to be removed or worked into the existing soil, a process requiring enormous labor. The irrigation systems, the carefully engineered networks of channels and sluices that controlled water flow to the paddies, were often damaged and required repair. And all of this had to be done with a population that was already weakened by weeks of inadequate nutrition. The diet during this long hunger period was a grim monotony of survival foods. A typical day might begin with a thin gruel made from barley or millet, perhaps flavored with a few leaves of wild greens. The midday meal might be a ball of rice mixed with whatever extender was available, maybe ground acorn or konnyaku, perhaps a small portion of pickled vegetables if any remained from the previous year's harvest. The evening meal would be similar, with the addition of a soup made from dried fish scraps or fermented bean paste, providing a minimal amount of protein and salt. This was subsistence eating, calculated to provide just enough calories to allow continued physical labor without causing complete collapse. Children and the elderly suffered disproportionately during these periods. The Japanese practice of prioritizing food distribution to working-age adults, those whose labor was essential to the family's survival and the community's recovery, meant that the very young and very old received smaller portions and lower quality food. Infant mortality spiked in the year following major floods as mothers weakened by poor nutrition produced insufficient milk, and the alternative foods available, thin grain gruels, were inadequate for infant development. The elderly, particularly those without family to care for them, faced abandonment in the most severe cases, a practice that, while rarely discussed openly, appears in historical records and folk tales as a grim reality of disaster survival. The psychological impact of the long hunger was profound. The Japanese cultural emphasis on stoicism, the concept of gammon or perseverance through hardship, became both a survival mechanism and a source of additional stress. Complaining about hunger or hardship was seen as shameful, a failure of character. Families maintained outward appearances of normalcy even as they struggled to find enough to eat. This cultural pressure to endure silently meant that actual suffering often went unrecorded, invisible only in the demographic records that show spikes in mortality during and after flood years. Yet through this suffering, a kind of knowledge was preserved and refined. Each flood disaster became a lesson in survival, and the lessons were encoded in practice and memory. Families learned which wild plants could be eaten and which were poisonous, knowledge that mothers passed to daughters through direct instruction during foraging expeditions. Villages refined their understanding of which locations were safe from flooding and which were vulnerable, information that influenced settlement patterns for generations. The shogunate and domain governments analyzed each disaster and attempted to improve their response systems, leading to the gradual development of better early warning systems for floods. It improved granary distribution networks and more realistic planning for post-disaster relief. The flood of 1742 and others like it became part of the collective memory of Tokugawa Japan, referenced in official histories, depicted in woodblock prints, and remembered in local festivals and commemorations. This cultural memory served a practical purpose, maintaining awareness of vulnerability and the need for preparation. The flood-prone regions developed their own culinary traditions based on preservation and adaptation, traditions that persisted even when the immediate danger passed. The foods of survival, the foraged greens, the preserved fish, the extended grains, became part of regional identity. Dishes that were eaten not from necessity, but as a link to the past and a reminder of resilience. What the samurai and peasants of flood-ravaged Japan ate was ultimately a reflection of a society's entire relationship with precarity and survival. It was food stripped of ceremony and refinement, reduced to its essential function as fuel for bodies that needed to work, to rebuild, to persevere. But within that stark functionality was a sophisticated understanding of nutrition, preservation, and resourcefulness that allowed one of the world's most densely populated pre-industrial societies to survive repeated catastrophes. The ability to transform tree bark into bread, to find protein in river mud, to preserve the inedible until it became edible, these were not primitive survival techniques, but rather the accumulated wisdom of centuries of living on the edge of disaster. When we examine what they ate, we're not just looking at a historical menu. We're looking at the caloric mathematics of civilization itself, the thin margin between survival and collapse, and the human ingenuity that repeatedly tilted the balance towards survival.